Hello. How are you?
Hey, I am doing all right. I am so worn out. I feel like I have just gone from thing to thing to thing for a good 2 months solid. And today is the first day where I don't have anything on the calendar. I mean, except talking to you, but who really cares? That's it. That's all I have. And it feels lovely to have that little to do today.
Nice. Yeah, I actually can really relate. Kristen and I were talking about the fact that it feels like this is the first day back to normal after all the holidays and vacations and Christmas and we had all sorts of things happening, and there's just been so much chaos. Inevitably, whenever I talk to my mother, sometime in January, she will always say, "I'm ready for the long winter's nap."
Yes. Yes, exactly. I know last night when the chaos finally did stop last night, my wife and I both came home. We put on pajama pants. We stoked a fire. We sat down on the couch and we were just like, oh, thank goodness we're here. We survived it all. So,
Well,
yeah.
congratulations. Yeah, I always laugh because this busy kind of season that we have, you often take time off in the middle of, but it's in part not unlike everybody else who's often taking time off because of like Christmas or whatever. You often take time off for your gingerbread party weekend, which means
Yes.
your time off is insanely chaotic.
Oh my
And
gosh.
then you're trying to cram the rest of the holiday busyness into an already full work schedule.
Yes. Yes. You have pegged my life very well.
Without any reference to Mecca whatsoever, ever. Impeccably.
Oh, we were just talking. So for the audience's benefit here, so we actually haven't recorded an episode in about a month, just because of all the holidays. So like we front loaded before the holidays, and now we're finally getting back into it. And you can tell we've got a little bit of rust to kick off.
Oh man, so let's get into it though. You are calling today because there's something you want to talk about.
Yes. I ran across a quote the other day that really I disagreed with initially, which is kind of shocking because it comes from a former professor of ours that we both have great respect for. And I don't know that I've ever just outright disagreed with him in my life. And yet, here it is. Here's my one moment. So I want to read that quote here in a minute, but it really just, it touches something that I wrestle with a lot in our evangelical culture. And that is, what's the real place of evangelism in the life of a Christian? And I'm not saying it has no place, but what is the place? What's the priority? What's the emphasis? And anyway, so let me get to the quote and then I want to discuss it. He was talking about the moment where Jesus curses the fig tree because the fig tree wasn't producing figs, even though it wasn't the season for figs. He curses the fig tree at the same time that he cleanses the temple. And it's this image of like, hey, Israel, or at least the Pharisees, you haven't been doing what you were supposed to be doing. And now I am going to make sure you shrivel up and die because you didn't do what you were supposed to do, what you were designed to do. And so he's asking the question, therefore, what are we supposed to do? He says fig trees are supposed to produce figs. Disciples are supposed to make disciples. And on the face of it, I think a lot of Christians believe that. And for me, I looked at it and went, wait a minute. Disciples aren't supposed to make disciples. That's not the definition of a disciple. Disciples are supposed to follow. Disciples have a job to be followers, learners, apprentices. the word disciple has nothing to do in and of itself with making other disciples any more than fig trees are supposed to make other fig trees. Fig trees are supposed to bear figs. We're supposed to produce discipleship, not necessarily, and I'm not saying it's antithetical, right? Like ultimately figs fall off the tree, they have the seed in them and they become other trees. And ultimately, if we're following Jesus appropriately, we will help make other disciples. Like I get that part, but it's not the sole definition of discipleship. So I'm wondering what your reaction is to this idea that disciples are meant to make disciples.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this. And we haven't said this yet, but let me go ahead and say this is from a book by Dr. Rodney Reeves. And I'll say that for two reasons. First of all, because anybody who's listening to this should read anything that Dr. Reeves has written, because he's been a profoundly influential person in both of our lives. Um, One of my
Yes.
most memorable lectures in my in my college experience was Dr. Reeves speaking about Jesus looking over Jerusalem and the passion that he had for the people of Israel. And it blew me away, um, as did much of what he opened my eyes to in terms of Jesus scholarship. So there are moments when you disagree with somebody, and it is an honor to come to a point of disagreement. Uh,
Yes.
and so you disagree out of respect, not without respect. Um,
Yeah.
and so I want to like mention Dr. Reeves' name specifically because I consider this a deeply respectful disagreement, if that
Yeah.
makes any sense.
100%. And it was out of respect that I didn't name him because that all of what you said is exactly true. So yes, I concur. Everybody should read Dr. Reeves. This is, by the way, his commentary on the book of Matthew from the Story of God Bible Commentary Series, and it has been wonderful. This is page number 415, and it's the first thing I've disagreed with. So there you go.
Yeah. So with that out of the way, when I think about that quote, I have several reactions to it. Reaction number one is it summarizes what I was taught spiritual maturity means quite effectively.
Mm,
And we talked about this idea of spiritual maturity in several previous episodes. The one on Stages of Faith, the one titled Truth, Ambiguity, and Trust. Um, and so we've been wrestling with this idea recently of what is the end goal of the spiritual life? What is the definition of maturity? And so coming from that question, if we were to answer the sole goal of spiritual maturity is to become a person who gets other people saved, I think that would be deeply reductionistic, right? And I think that's
yeah.
probably what you're reacting to.
Yes, it is. And I think I'm also reacting to the fact that you already said it. This is how we were taught when we were growing up. The reductionism that you're referring to has been unquestioned in my lifetime or in many of the circles of which I've been a part. And I want to actually question it. And I want to say, wait a minute, there is more to the story here than making other disciples. And I don't want to negate the idea that we're supposed to make other disciples. I still believe in the Great Commission. But I also believe the Great Commission is only a couple of verses in the entire Bible. So let's put it in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. This leads to my next question. My next question is, in the first century, when this idea of disciple was being used by Jesus and his followers, what did they mean by the word disciple? It's not a question of what do I think disciple should be. It's a question of what did the Jesus and those early users mean? And did Jesus and did the broader kind of religious culture expect disciples to become disciple makers, right?
Hmm.
And fortunately, you sent me a little bit of this topic. You sent me that quote several days ago, and we were texting back and forth about it. And I knew I was going to ask this question, so I got a chance to do a little bit of research on it, which is nice.
Oh,
Um,
fantastic.
so I'm only partially speaking in ignorance, which is the
Hey,
best I can ever hope for.
this is a step up from most of our other episodes. So here we go.
Where I am normally speaking in complete ignorance. Uh, but in thinking about the Great Commission, go and make disciples, it was interesting. I ran across in the Mishnah, which is sort of the gathering of the oral tradition several generations after Jesus. The
Hmm.
writing down happened several generations after Jesus, which means there's a good chance this is sort of what people were thinking about orally in the time of Jesus. Is that a decent summary of the Mishnah?
It is. I would add that it's Jewish. This is Jewish
Oh,
oral tradition.
thank you. Yes. So this is exactly. So when Jesus uses a word that is unique to or distinctive in Jewish religious thinking, this is a good place to go to ask, what would Jesus' listeners have heard? And this is one quote from the Mishnah that I found says, Moses received the Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. They said three things: be deliberate in judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. The things that I thought were interesting about this were A, it kind of draws this link by link discipleship framework of Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, prophets to the assembly. And then it does say that the three things that make you a good Jewish person, one of them was raising up disciples. So part of this being a disciple of this great train throughout history was making disciples.
Well, I'm wondering, though, if maybe you can add a little bit more context to this quote from the Mishnah, because when I hear that, right, I hear Moses, an individual, to Joshua, an individual, to the elders, a group of people, to the prophets, a much larger uh, span of time kind of group of individuals, but a specific group, to the community, to a nation, to a people. And so now I think it's gone from individuals to a community. And so now, is this an individual responsibility? Is this a communal responsibility? And who's the audience for this quote in the Mishnah?
That's a great question. So this is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this, but it is the first verse of a book of the Mishnah, introducing essentially a book of wisdom, ethical living. But I think you raise an interesting question. Is this a distinct command every individual is given? Or is this a corporate command we are given as a community? Make disciples. So it's not a question of, am I going to make a disciple? It is a question of, are we as the church functioning effectively to be a community that makes disciples? And whatever part you're playing, if you are, to be very, very concrete here, if you're holding a baby in nursery, you are part of the disciple making community because you are allowing, A, you're allowing that child to find out that it's safe in church, and B, you are allowing those parents to focus on being discipled. And so whatever part you're playing, you need to be a part of the. So I guess I'm saying, is this an individual command or a communal mission? Is a question I think you're raising.
Yes, yes. And I very much land on the communal mission. And I think that allows all of us to lean into our unique giftings. And I'm so glad you started with holding a baby in nursery, because I think those who are gifted that direction, and I'm married to one and my daughter is another, I think it's easy for them to look at their role and see it as not a part of the discipleship making process. And so when they hear go and make disciples, it's easy to hear, oh shoot, I need to become an evangelist. I need to become, an extrovert. I need to be able to knock on doors. I'm not doing that. I'm not living into what God told me to do. I'm sinning. I'm wrong. I'm whatever it is. Goodness. I think we heap a lot of unnecessary guilt on somebody when we don't clearly define that this is a communal activity and you need to take part within your community to do your share based on the way God has created you.
Yeah, I think I want to push back on this a little bit. I don't think you're wrong, but I think that both of these are essential. I think on some level, this is both an individual command and a communal mission. Let's start off by saying if either one are presented in a way that makes me feel shame before God, I'm probably missing the boat.
Hmm.
However, I think overemphasizing the individual command can make us miss how important the various roles in the community are, that we are a disciple making community. I also think on the flip side, every believer benefits from having relationships outside of the church and needs to know how to represent Jesus well outside of the church in an attractive way.
Hmm.
And I think it could be easy for those of us like myself who are deeply introverted. It could be very easy for us to say, well, I have a communal role. I'm the media guy, whatever. I make sure that the preacher gets heard every Sunday morning. I click on the slides so that people who are new in church know the worship songs, whatever it is I'm doing. So when I go to my job at wherever, it's not my responsibility to bring up Jesus.
Yeah. Good corrective. Good point. Yes, we need to be witnessing to the Lamb in all things, in our behavior, in our speech, in all ways. So, yes, I agree with that. And as you're talking about it, I'm thinking specifically about a friend of mine who has such a unique ministry. He was able to retire early, and so he has spent much of his retirement time just showing up for people. And not because he set out to have a ministry of presence or anything like that. He was just presented with all of these moments where various people in his life have suffered tragedies. And he's like, man, I guess I've got the time and they sure need people to show up for them. So I'm just going to do that. And then the next thing happened and the next thing happened. And before you know it, he's spending quite a bit of time just connecting with people because they need it. And he has also known, hey, I know you're not a Christian, but man, I know you need Jesus. And so I'm just not going to be ashamed to walk into this moment. And as I'm loving on you, say, hey, can I pray for you? I know that that's not necessarily your thing, but I'd really love to pray for you. And
Mm.
holy smokes, people are responding. People are asking him questions about his faith and leaning into Christianity in brand new ways. And he doesn't feel equipped to be an evangelist. He doesn't feel equipped to be a pastor or to answer all these questions or whatever. He feels very inadequate toward all of that. And yet, because he's willing to just step into people's lives and just pray with them, he's getting those opportunities. And he's like, I don't even know what to do. But then at the same time that he doesn't have all the answers, people appreciate that he doesn't have all the answers. It's amazing how God is using him despite what he would say as being underqualified for it.
I think that's a great example. And it's the thing I love is it's him finding a way to be himself
Yes.
in a way that is attracting people to Jesus, which I think is what to bring glory to God. I think that means attracting people to Jesus. We're
Mm.
making Jesus look good in other people's eyes. A very different example of this, I have several friends that we all got out of college about the same time. And I went into ministry and they went into a variety of other things, finance and chemistry and all sorts of things. But what I found fascinating as I watched their careers is they were just people who loved Jesus, and it impacted everything about the way they behaved. As a result, they were very quick to be promoted in their organizations because they were the people with the most integrity. They were the people with the greatest work ethic. They were the people who were going to get it done when nobody else could get it done and who were going to take responsibility when something went wrong.
Mm.
And all of that invites fascinating conversations with people you work for. They were just being the people they thought Jesus wanted them to be. And that got noticed.
Yes, and I think that's my point. When we reduce discipleship down to disciples make other disciples, it sounds like an obligation to become an evangelist. It sounds like an obligation to go and like give people the four spiritual laws or whatever. Instead of disciples follow, disciples just make Jesus the center of everything. That can't help but influence how you show up in the world and the way you choose to pray for people or set an example for people or whatever you do. It's because you have actively chosen to follow, to be an apprentice to Jesus. That's discipleship.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting. Another piece of how we grew up that I have come to disagree with. I grew up being told if you do things Jesus's way, the world is going to hate you, right? Like you are going to just make enemies fast. And I don't know that I think that that's true. I think that some people are going to maybe not like the way you act, and that's fine. But I guess here's the distinction I think I've learned. If we talk about how other people ought to be, because that's what Jesus wants them to do, we will quickly make enemies in the world. And this is sometimes what we think bringing Jesus into the conversation means, right? We think it means telling everybody else how they ought to act because of who Jesus is,
Mm.
instead of focusing my attention on how I can act because of who Jesus is. Very seldom does that offend people.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. The idea of offending. As I look at Jesus's life, the crowds loved him. The people that saw his humility, his generosity, his graciousness, his wisdom, loved him.
Mm-hmm.
The people who were in power were threatened by him because a power greater than themselves had shown up. And so it was the religious leaders and the Roman officials that hated him and ultimately crucified him. And I think the same is true today. The people who need love and acceptance and grace and healing and all of those things are going to love Christians who are following Jesus. But the people who are in power are going to hate the claim of exclusivity and ultimate allegiance that Jesus demands.
I think that's exactly right. And another piece of this that I think we have to pull into the conversation is that this quote we're getting from Dr. Reeves is in the context of a commentary rather than a theological work, which means often it is complicated to fully nuance thoughts because of the structure of the book. I suspect if we asked Dr. Reeves directly, do you think the only sign of maturity is a disciple making other disciples? I doubt he'd say yes.
Oh,
Um,
and all of his writings and teachings that I've experienced clearly say that that's not what he really thinks.
right. And so I wonder to what degree the pithiness of what he was saying is a result of the structural limitations of a commentary rather than like his book on, is it John?
So yeah,
Right?
spirituality according to John.
Yeah, spirituality, which is far more there's room to nuance some thoughts there in a little bit more different of a way than a commentary offers. Does that make sense?
It does. I don't know that that plays as much of a role in this commentary because this commentary is designed to be far more accessible than most commentaries. And
Mm,
so, and it's definitely in the section of the commentary where he's meant to draw out some of the applications and nuance some things. So, though I would agree with you for the commentary genre, I'm not sure that it applies in this moment.
that's
Um,
fair.
I honestly, to be quite honest, I don't think this is how he thinks. However, I do think it is a part of the milieu in which he was raised and in which he teaches. And I think it was easy to unquestioningly just say it because it has been said in his presence and in his context so many times. And I think if he were to stop and think about it as a statement, I don't know that he would agree with it. But here it is anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's, I texted you when we were texting about this. This is the heart and soul of Robert Coleman's Master Plan of Evangelism, which was a textbook in multiple classes that I took. I
Yeah.
can't, I don't know if it was two or three different times I had to read that book. And it basically says this one thing. If you are going to be a disciple, your job is to make other disciples. And it positively compared the Christian message to a Ponzi scheme, right?
Mm.
Or to, is that the right word? Did I say that right? Ponzi scheme?
Yeah. Yeah. Or a pyramid scheme. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So all I know is that that means that I think one of the 12 initial disciples, probably Paul, is getting serious commission on all the disciples that we are making, which is very exciting for him.
Oh, man.
So,
Yeah. His spiritual bank account is stacked.
ooh,
He's like, oh, good. Another
ooh,
person
ooh.
read Romans. I'm loading up.
Yes. He's doing okay. But
Romans is
so,
just Paul's spiritual annuity.
yes, that's exactly what I think Paul was going for. Um, so I want to, I'm coming back to this kind of initial question, and we glossed over the idea of evangelism fairly quickly and the interrelationship between evangelism and discipleship. Is it worth pausing to ask the question? Because Dr. Reeves used the word disciples. Disciples make disciples.
Yes.
Is it worth differentiating evangelism and discipleship or disciple making in that context?
Yeah. I mean, regardless of how Dr. Reeves mentioned it, I think the two things have become synonymous, at least in my mind, if I'm not thinking about it. I can make a theological distinction if I'm being more careful, but if you just say disciples make disciples, I'm immediately going to think evangelism. And I think you're hinting at something that is very important, which is making a disciple is far more than just sharing the gospel with somebody. And so because you're hinting that direction, how would you distinguish the two?
Yeah, I think this is part of the way in which I think the word disciple or discipleship begins to answer the discomfort or respond to the discomfort that you have. I think evangelism to me, and again, I'm not going to say these are what the words are supposed to mean. These are all words that Paul and the Bible use, and they use them positively. But the way that I have incorporated them into my own thinking, evangelism feels like it's, based on evangelism explosion and things like that. If you were to die tonight, where would you go? kinds of getting people to sign on the dotted line in a pressure sales tactic kind of way. That's what that feels like to me. Whereas discipleship, in my mind, really means inviting people into the relationship with Jesus in which he is master and they are apprentice. And I even wonder if part of the reason Dr. Reeves is comfortable saying what he's saying is that in focusing on the discipleship language, I wonder if he is stepping beyond the evangelism language that we are uncomfortable with.
Well, even if he is, I still think it misses something, because when you say
Absolutely.
disciples make disciples, it is completely ignoring your own discipleship, your own growth, your own responsibility to follow and to learn. And so if that's not part of the equation, if you're not showing up, interacting with a genuine relationship with Jesus, then what are you doing? Like, you can't just, I'm a Christian. Now my job is to make other Christians, and completely neglect your own growth and your own relationship with God. Well, then you're doing nothing but exactly what you said earlier, a Ponzi scheme. It's a pyramid scheme. Okay, I'm in the pyramid. Now I need to make 5 more below me so that I can move up in the pyramid. That's it.
Well, and in that context, one of the things I would respond, even in sort of an effort to defend Dr. Reeves' words, I would say that that is not disciples making disciples. I would say that that is faux disciples making disciples. That is Pharisees making Pharisees.
Mm.
To claim to be a disciple who is making disciples, first and foremost positions me as a disciple, one who has sought to live my life orbiting around the center of my master. And in some ways, it doesn't ignore that. It starts there, right? Disciples make disciples, not people make disciples.
Well, I mean, I think you made a great point. I really love the way you said it a moment ago. I think you're right. Disciples make disciples. Pharisees make Pharisees. Atheists make atheists, right? This is how the world works. You
Absolutely.
have an influence on somebody, and if you're intentional about that influence, you are likely going to steer them in the direction where you currently are. And are you a disciple? Are you a Pharisee? Are you something else entirely? Whatever you're attempting to do for somebody begins with who you are currently.
Absolutely. And I think authentic relationship inherently has this impact. I mean, if I'm really good friends with someone who's vegan, there is a far better chance that I will become a vegan than if I have no friends who are a vegan. If
Mm.
I am really good friends with people whose political perspectives are significantly more conservative or significantly more liberal than mine, I am far more likely to be drawn in that direction. What we follow, we inspire others to follow.
Yes. Yes. And this is why every single one of us needs to have a role in evangelism, in a role
Hmm.
in sharing the gospel. Because if we leave it up to pastors, and that's the only people that do evangelism, pastors have a particular gifting and skill set. And if we're not careful, and if we're not active as a part of that, it's really easy to think, oh, well, then in order to become a Christian, I need to have the skill set that this guy has. Whereas, when my friend is showing up for people and he's like, I don't have all that theological training. I don't have all these giftings to stand up in front of people and to teach and to lead and all of that. I just show up for people and I love them dearly and I pray for them like crazy. And if that's the person who leads you to Jesus, then you start going, oh, well, then I could be like that. And on down the line, as you talk about various people with various giftings, just sharing the gospel, it frees people up to explore the gospel from a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And the other piece of this, at least for me, the way I am an excited transmitter of an idea, whatever it is that I'm interested in, is to continue to be excited by diving in more and more. I think of my son. My son absolutely loves. There is a musical that has been written, entirely released online, of Homer's work, The Odyssey. And the music is amazing. But the reason I've listened to it is because every time a little more big, a little piece of it gets released, my son gets all excited and tells me all about it. And I'm like, oh, let me check that out. And the fact that something is keeping his excitement about that alive as he gets more and more and more into it gets me more and more excited about it. And I think if we are going to be sharers of anything, we have to continue to get excited about it ourselves.
Mm,
Does that make
yes.
sense?
Oh, 10,000%. In fact, I cannot wait to get to the
That's a
thoughts
lot of
segment.
percents.
Yeah, I know. You're just going to have to live with it. Um, I,
Okay.
I can't wait to get to the thoughts segment of our episode because my thought is going to be related to that thought entirely.
Ooh. Well, I am excited to get to thoughts now.
I know. So let's hurry up, invite the audience to participate in the conversation, and then let's get back to it.
Okay, audience, we would love to have you participate. So, what were your thoughts, Josh? Um, was that too fast?
It might be a little perfunctory. Um, we do love
Oh,
you, audience. Thank you for participating. Actually, genuinely, thank you for participating. I've had a couple of opportunities to talk with folks recently about their experience with the podcast, and I tell you what, I just get so jazzed. So I love that these conversations spur other conversations and get people thinking and talking. So by all means, share this episode with a friend and start your own conversation about the role of discipleship. What does it mean to truly be a disciple?
yes, absolutely. I would love both to hear your thoughts and to hear the stories. So please let us know and share this. That would be great. But with all that in mind and all sorts of excitement buzzing, Josh from Oregon, what are your thoughts?
I just finished reading such an amazing book, and I don't really know how it ended up on my to read list. So I'm actually nervous that you're going to be like, yeah, I told you to read that. Um, Unreasonable Hospitality. Have you read this?
I have not.
All right. Like I said, I don't know how I got to reading this book, but I'm so thankful that I did. The guy who wrote this is a restaurateur who took 11 Madison Park, which is a restaurant in New York City, from a good restaurant to ultimately being ranked the #1 restaurant in the world. So not only do they just have a single-minded obsession with perfection and improving every little detail that could possibly be improved, they made their mark as a restaurant by becoming incredibly hospitable. They wanted the guest experience to be amazing. They wanted to blow their guests' mind every single time they showed up. And they took this to the nth degree. It's just, I could talk endlessly about what all they did. But I'll just give one example and I'll tease you with that so that everybody goes and reads this book because it's so much fun. But they ended up doing what they ultimately called legends. And it started with a guest, a family came in, they had their luggage with them. They said, oh my goodness, we had such a great time in New York. We actually ate at this amazing restaurant and that amazing restaurant and blah, blah, blah. And this is our last stop. We have to get on a plane later. The only thing we didn't get to do in New York was to have a New York street hot dog. And the manager hears this, the guy that's writing the book hears this, and he's like, oh, I got you. And so unknown to these guests, he went out to like the local street hot dog place, picked up a couple hot dogs, brought them back in, handed them to the chef and said, I want you to plate these. And he's like, a dirty water dog? Are you serious? And he's like, no, seriously, I want you to plate these. And so he plated them, he gussied them up a little bit and sent them on. The guests flipped out. He was like, I've never had a reaction from a guest that I had like from these guys. He's like, this cost me like $10. And these guys were so over the moon that we would go the extra mile to like get them the one thing that they couldn't get in New York. And he's like, it just blew their minds. And so they ended up doing these types of things as a restaurant. Every single part of the wait staff looked out for opportunities to do that kind of stuff. So one guy joked about, like, it was offered, hey, do you want X at the end of your meal or whatever? Yes, no, I got to get back to the office. What I could really use is $1 million or, $100,000 or something like that to close this deal or whatever. And so they went out and bought him 10 $100,000 candy bars and give them to him in a bag. And he's like, so he opens this bag of, quote, money, and he's like, oh, look, there's $100,000. He lost it. He thought it was hilarious. And it was this great little like extra touch at the end of the thing. Anyway, on and on and on it goes about all of these legendary ways that they just made the guest experience the best ever. And his heartbeat for hospitality and truly taking care of a guest was so infectious. It made me want to think about how to take care of people better, how to just unreasonably be hospitable to somebody, to just go over the top for people. And he wasn't moralizing or sermonizing. He was just sharing his passion all through the book. And it was infectious. And I couldn't get enough.
I love that. It reminds me of, stop me if I've told the story to you before, but in Covert Cows, it's a book on the philosophy of Chick-fil-A.
Mm.
They tell a story that's like this. I don't remember the context of how this happened, but down south somewhere, they're having in this massive, massive flood, and somebody's house is entirely flooded. And for some reason, the number that he calls is the local Chick-fil-A. And like, he can't get out of his house. Like, he is completely stuck, like second floor, entirely flooded. And he calls the Chick-fil-A because it's like the number on redial, whatever. And he's just like, hey, I need, and they ask, well, how can we help? And he says, well, I don't know. I'm just stuck, whatever. So the employee who answers the phone actually, after leaving, like after saying goodbye on the phone, actually figures it out, like gets a boat to like go rescue this guy. And he is saved because he called Chick-fil-A. No. And the guy's point is, now that's good service.
Yes.
It's never bad to go the extra mile. I love that. I now I want to read this book. What did you say it was called again? Unreasonable Hospitality?
Yes, exactly.
That's amazing. I look forward to reading it.
Oh yeah. It's a delight. Every single page is wonderful. So what about you? What else are you thinking about?
Well, I have been reading over the writings of Paul lately, and I came to 1 Corinthians 13. And 1 Corinthians 13 is one of those chapters that I guess I have sort of a bad taste in my mouth because I associate it with like the hallmarky Christian memorabilia stuff, right? Like I expect it to be in flowing cursive on a piece of driftwood in somebody's front hall. Right?
Yes, it was such an accurate picture. It makes me laugh. That's so great.
And I came to the verse in which Paul says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And the beauty and the rhythm of that, again, gives it potential to be put on a sign somewhere. But as I've been sitting with that, and particularly I'm reading Paul's writings, and at the same time, I'm reading Michael Gorman's Cruciformity, the essence of which is for us to be disciples of Jesus means that as Jesus fully lived out his God-centered life in his crucifixion, to participate in the life of Jesus means to live a life that is shaped by the cross, suffering, and sacrifice. And in that
Mm-hmm.
context, these words, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, become so much more. When I first read these words, I often think, I think to myself, well, how do I avoid being taken advantage of? How do I avoid giving too much, something unhealthy? But the cross doesn't invite me to ask that as my primary question, right? The crucifixion of Jesus was giving too much. It was sacrificing more than was healthy to sacrifice. It cost him something. And certainly there are lines we need to not cross in ways that we love that are empowering unhealth in other people. And that's not what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But love that chooses to bear, believe, hope, and endure is just a challenging way to live. And I am inspired by the cross shaped way of living, beautifully captured in those words.
Yeah, that is really good and really hard. I was just having a conversation with somebody about irritations that they're having with their church and how hard it is to just endure the same minor cuts over and over and over within the church, and it's not as though it's a sin issue, it's just an irritation issue. And it's like, okay, this is my church, we're aligned on so many things, but I keep having this nagging irritation and it keeps happening, and what do I do with that? And I think that's exactly what these verses are encouraging us to wrestle with.
Yeah, absolutely. I aspire to be better at this.
Hmm. Yes.
Um, uh,
Well,
but
I aspire to ruin the vibe
ooh, go
because
ahead.
it's time for a witch Josh. And so we're just going to like hard left here and dive into the witch Josh.
All right. What's our Witch Josh question for today?
Witch Josh got beaten up by a snowman.
And this is me. This happened several days ago. This was 3 or 4 days ago. And I still have a giant, like almost pirate style cut on my face because of this.
What? Okay, hang on. One, I just think it says something about your strength that you lost a fight to a snowman. And two, what is a pirate style cut exactly?
Well, like a giant like gash across your cheek that like you'd
Oh,
picture, like yeah. So, and I didn't exactly get beat up by a snowman, though I certainly could have. But on this last week, we had the perfect snow, and it all started because of this podcast. Because if you will recall, before Christmas, I promised that I would make a snowman if the right snow ever fell.
yes, yes, you did.
So the right snow fell, and I'm getting ready to go outside and shovel my driveway. And I don't understand what it is about driveways, but they get longer as you shovel them, which is interesting to me. But my daughter comes up to me and she's like, "Dad, you said on the podcast that you would make a snowman if it snowed. And it snowed. So are we making a snowman?" And I said, "Sure, we'll make a snowman." So the three of us, my son, my daughter, and I, made a snowman. And it ended up being 8.5 feet tall, which is a
Holy smokes.
pretty good snowman. However, the result of this was that we had a very hard time getting the middle snowman ball onto the lower snowman ball. So we had to build a snow ramp to get the snowball, the second snowball onto the first snowball. And in getting the snow ramp, I only have one shovel because it doesn't snow a lot in Missouri. So my son is shoveling snow over onto the ramp to where we want the ramp to be. And I'm like going over and like we have a wall near where we were building the snowman. And so I was going over and gathering like handfuls of snow and dumping them on the spot so that I could add to the snow pile that we were making. And I leaned over to dump snow onto the snow pile. And my son at the same time was throwing snow, and the shovel with my 17-year-old son's full strength behind it connected hard on my face.
Oh,
And so I had this giant welt on my face and this gash across my cheek. Now, fortunately, there aren't a lot of nerves apparently in one's cheek because it didn't hurt very much, but it looked pretty bad.
wow. So he almost killed his father. He needs to prepare to die. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, yes. I don't know that he knows that reference, but that just proves that I'm a bad father that he doesn't know that reference.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, repent of your ways. We need to end the podcast, and you need to go show the Princess Bride to your son right now.
All right. I will at least end the podcast.
I know, repentance has never been your thing.
No, I prefer to die in my sins. But all right.
Okay.
Well, are we on for next week?
I can't wait. Let's do it.
All right. I'll talk to you then.
All right. Bye-bye.